Okay, relaxing overtime rules and weakening National Labor Relations Board oversight of labor. Bobby Scott, on the other hand, one of the things I'm pretty certain he's going to do is raise a $15 minimum wage bill. Again, is that going to pass? I don't want to get anyone's hopes up, but at least it's going to be discussed, it's going to get on the agenda. College affordability. Now, there's a question about whether the Democrats are going to be bold enough to go with Bernie Sanders' free college education for everyone. From what I'm reading, I don't think they're going to do that, but they're going to do something about college education, college affordability, and more regulating of for-profit colleges who they feel are ripping people off and wasting individuals' money and taxpayer money. And then finally, protecting union protections, especially given the Supreme Court rulings that have come down recently. In terms of oversight, not a lot of oversight, as we know from the Republicans the past couple of years, but one of the things that the Republicans have been doing is calling in the Equal Employment Opportunity commissioners and telling them they're being too aggressive in going after businesses for violations. So that's kind of interesting. And then on the other hand, one of the things that people on the Education Committee are talking about in terms of oversight is that DeVos has kind of gotten a free pass when she came in and is not being scrutinized for things that she's doing about allowing guns in schools and supporting for-profit colleges, different interesting things in her background, and that she will really get more of a grilling now under Democratic control. Okay, so before I click through, I'm going over my time. Why is the workforce in quotes? Well, one of the more mundane battles between Democrats and Republicans is each time party control changes, Democrats change that second phrase, education and to labor, so it'll be the Education and Labor Committee. And then the next time Republicans take control, they'll change it back to Education and the Workforce Committee. So there's linguistic battles that are going on about framing what this committee is really about and avoiding use of the word labor. So that's kind of interesting, just as a side note. Judiciary Committee, our fellow New Yorker, Manhattanite from the West Side, Jerry Nadler, is going to be taking over, which will be a big shift ideologically from Bob Goodlatte from Virginia. Goodlatte, while he was on the Judiciary Committee, was interested in trying to increase the period of time in which abortions are legal. He was promoting this Stop Online Piracy Act. Nadler, we're not sure. We know he wants to do something about gun control as a top priority. The Judiciary Committee certainly has jurisdiction over these two other things. I'm not sure that they're his personal preferences, but anything that happens with the Dreamers is going to go through Judiciary Committee and stands a much better chance now, theoretically. Sentencing reform, and stop filling up our prisons. That there's some that could be a bipartisan area potentially, and that would go through Judiciary Committee. What kind of, again, not much oversight. The oversight that they did was investigating FBI agents who are in a conspiracy against Trump and grilling them, and expect that to change to things like Trump interference in the Justice Department. And that's particularly timely that this was written before we realized that Jeff, in case you didn't hear, Jeff Sessions was asked to resign today. Anything about immigration and customs enforcement, family separations, those types of interrogations of ICE would happen in the Judiciary Committee oversight setting. And then finally, impeachment, question mark, probably not. I think the Democrats, and particularly Jerry Nadler, was there in the 90s when Republicans tried to impeach Bill Clinton, and then that he watched what happened, which was that wasn't very helpful to Republicans. And so I think people like Nadler are going to be more cool to that idea of impeachment. And then finally, Financial Services Committee. This is, I saved the starkest difference for last. More conservative than 99%, it's changing to more liberal than 99% of the House. And any of you who have been following politics know that Maxine Waters is one of the biggest irritants for the president, or actually foils maybe is a better term. And so, Jet Hensarling was pushing for rollback of Dodd-Frank. He was pushing for scaling back Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in order to save the government money there. Maxine Waters is interested in strengthening Consumer Protection Bureau, making housing more affordable, and improving the student loan program. In terms of oversight, again, this relates to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, grilling FHA administrators about why they're issuing loans to people who are poor and can't pay them back. And Maxine Waters, this will be interesting, this is a little wonky, but when I read up on it, people may know more about this than me. So SAR stands for Suspicious Activity Reports. And this came up and wasn't covered a lot in the news, but apparently banks were flagging these weird payments that Michael Cohen was withdrawing lots of money and then using it to pay people under aliases. So basically these are kind of like the payments to Stormy Daniels et al. And the volume of these like withdrawals and deposits in Michael Cohen's accounts, all of a sudden someone tried to FOIA them and they didn't exist. So the bank said, hey, we filed this with the Treasury Department. The Treasury Department says, oh, we don't have anything like that. So what happened there? That'll be an interesting story. And then there's again, this could be a conspiracy theory, but it'd be interesting to find out. There's a lot of guesswork about how much money Deutsche Bank loaned to Donald Trump and how much of that came through Russia or what the conditions were on those loans. And the Republicans certainly didn't want to talk about that, but Maxine Waters will. Okay. So that's just a little flavor of what's coming up.
I'm going to be much briefer than the first two speakers because A, I haven't been spending enough time at bars to get some interesting stories, and B, I know far less about American politics than any of my colleagues on the panel. Charles asked me to speak to the impact of international relations on the election and its the election's implications for U.S. foreign policy, and actually I think the story is pretty marginal on both of those accounts, but especially on the first side, on how international affairs really got very little coverage in the several months leading up to the election. That's not the case earlier in the administration. There's certainly a lot to talk about in terms of Trump's really, his embrace of foreign dictators, his embrace of Putin, his totally ham-handed performance at the summit, where he was, roundly condemned his last summit with Putin, his vacillating policies on North Korea. It goes from fire and fury to I love that guy within a few months, and nothing really of substance, with nothing really of substance happening. But I think Trump successfully turned the agenda from these issues, or maybe they didn't have so much salience for the public because the Democrats didn't make a big deal of them in the midterms. Congress has less to say over foreign policy than the presidency, so they're really the people who are running for Senate and the House are really focusing on issues that they can say that they want to address when they take office. And health care for the Democrats was the biggest one that they focused on. And I think Trump was successful in trying to distract people from his failings in foreign policy and domestic policy by just these erratic lurches and crazy statements about Kavanaugh and immigration and so on. So I really don't think foreign policy had a big impact on this election. The election, in terms of how the election will affect U.S. foreign policy, I know one thing for sure, which is that the election really solved one of the biggest threats to American security that we've seen in a long time. And that's the army of ISIS and criminals marching up from Honduras to the border, who deviously were disguised as small children, parents, penniless, without any arms or even motorized vehicles. But yet, with, fortunately, with the swift movement of a number of U.S. troops to the border and the fact that the election is over, I think that we'll find that this danger to America will just totally disappear. As I mentioned, the House, Congress doesn't have a huge amount of authority over foreign policy. The House even less than the Senate. So in terms of the Senate, it's going to be business as usual. I do think that the defense budget is something that is going to be challenged big time in the next budget cycle. Trump ramped it up by, I think, $100 billion or something, with no real justification. And I think having a Democratic House propose a much more reasonable, smaller budget, and saying, pointing to the trade-offs much more clearly than they were able to as a minority, I think will lead to really big budget battles, and will throw this question into greater, will give it greater attention than it did in the past 2 years. I think the other main effects of Democratic control of the House are in the oversight function that David talked about, because there are at least 3 committees with oversight in foreign affairs, and they're going to use this to, I think, harass Trump endlessly. You might remember when the shoe was on the other foot, the endless Benghazi hearings that were held trying to embarrass the Obama administration, embarrass Hillary Clinton over really some unfortunate episodes that really didn't stack up to any serious malfeasance or misrepresentations. And this consumed, I think, maybe 3 years, 6 separate Republican-led committees, including a special select committee to investigate the Benghazi hearings. And so, and now there's actually a lot of interesting stuff to investigate, far more, I think far more controversial and potentially illegal than what happened at that embassy in Libya. So on the House Armed Services Committee, which I think will be, I don't know, you probably know this better than me, David, but Adam Smith is somebody who was the minority leader, may continue as the majority, as the chairman now, or he was the ranking minority member of the committee. And here there's lots of oversight action that can happen, the way that the defense budget will be scrutinized, requiring Mattis or whoever his successor is to come in and justify different programs, the Space Force, military assistance to Saudi Arabia, lots of things that are really, the Trump administration would rather be swept under the carpet, hasn't gotten nearly the media attention that it could. The House Intelligence Committee, you all followed probably the kind of very weak and limited investigations into Russian hacking in the U.S. elections, and the Democratic National Committee email servers, and the question of collusion. And I think the Republican committee ended their investigation without issuing a single subpoena. The Senate committee has been a bit more bipartisan, but and I think may still be continuing at a very low level. But I think that these investigations will be renewed with a lot more aggressive investigative action. So an issue that's been really really under the radar, because Mueller, although there's some information that's been leaked out, he's really kept things pretty close to his chest about exactly where the investigation is going. I think the Democrats will take this opportunity to really have a full public review of all the meetings that were held, all the possible points at which cooperation might have occurred, communications occurred between Trump campaign officials, Trump family members, and Russian ambassadors or representatives. Another committee in Foreign Affairs is the House Foreign Affairs Committee. The ranking minority member is Elliot Engel, who will probably take over that committee, but I don't know, maybe not. Whoever takes it over is going to give a full public hearing to, for example, the gutting of the State Department that occurred under the Trump administration, first Tillerson, people leaving en masse, and apparent loyalty tests for people being hired into different agencies. The whole question of Trump family and Trump organization entanglement with foreign governments that do business with the United States, and whether the emoluments clause, I think this might be the House Foreign Affairs Committee, or maybe another committee. I think that will get a much more aggressive exposure, investigation, and so I think while the Democrats looking ahead to 2020 don't want to come across as just purely negative, they want to set forward some kind of positive agenda. They also have, I think this is one of the most effective ways that they have to fight back against the basic PR, propaganda, deceit that comes out of the White House basically on a daily basis, and that they are gonna be using this as a mechanism to question the president's veracity. There's all kinds of potential. I mean, so many heads of agencies have already been forced to resign because of conflicts of interest and inappropriate behavior. I'm sure that there will be much more to come. So.
I will try to keep my remarks candidates and parties do in the campaign, how that sort of relates to the governing that happens afterwards. So I'm interested in what candidates are saying in their communications, what the parties are saying in their communications. And so that usually points us towards an agenda that they're going to follow once they get into power. So one of the things that I look at are political ads. I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of weeks looking at political ads, and I'm surprised I'm sitting here in front of you today because it's kind of mind-numbing. But what's pretty clear about Democrats, you see their concerns are pretty apparent. 50% of Democratic ads in this cycle focused on healthcare, mentioned healthcare. That is more than double what you usually see. So definitely healthcare was the issue. Something to look for down the road is how Democrats are going to deal with how they're going to proceed on this issue, because everybody talks about Medicare for all. That's what you saw all the Democrats talking about. When you actually drill down and you go and look at the candidate websites, that means different things for different Democrats. For more progressive Bernie type Democrats, that means basically a single payer system. When you look at more moderate Democrats in the suburbs, what I was seeing is that means basically allowing people to buy into Medicare. So remember that public option that got jettisoned from the Affordable Care Act? Essentially, that's what they're now, some people are envisioning, is just allowing people in places where they don't have a lot of access to plans to buy into Medicare. And so it's going to be that public option that might actually bring down costs. That's public option was supposed to be one of the chief mechanisms where they brought down insurance premiums with that. So it'll be interesting to see how Democrats negotiate that and what comes out in the legislation that they eventually settle on. Another thing that we saw lots of education, obviously. Something that I never see in ads a discussion of is gun control. And in this election cycle, that changed. So that means that usually it's just an issue. You're not going to, people are so divided on that issue, there's no point talking about it, but obviously they saw that it was worth starting to talk about that issue. Something else that we saw a lot in this election cycle, across ballots, across the states, are measures concerning election reform. So we saw yesterday, we saw in Colorado and Utah and Michigan, they adopted independent redistricting commissions. Right? And so we had 4 states that had independent redistricting commissions. We'll have 3 more. Missouri revised their redistricting commission to make it, I guess, slightly less partisan. And so that's interesting. We also saw a couple of states adopt same-day voter registration measures, automatic voter registration. And then we saw, obviously in Florida, we saw 1.5 million people re-enfranchised. And to put that into perspective, that's a larger number than the population of 10 states in our country, right? So it's massive, it's huge. And so what this points to, and actually there is legislation already, a comprehensive voter election law reform bill. I believe Sarbanes from Maryland has proposed it, which is going to propose a lot of these things. And so coming back to what David was saying, you know, throwing these things out there that are popular, that you know are going to go nowhere, right? So it calls for independent redistricting commissions in the states. It calls for automatic voter registration in the states. It calls for public financing of congressional candidates. So it's kind of, you know, election reformers' dream, everything thrown in, kitchen sink kind of model. But it looks like that is going to be one of the first things that they throw out there. And that's going to come home in New York too. So I don't know if you're aware, but New York is kind of backwards in terms of how they administer their elections. You know something about that, right? You don't have any early voting. You don't have, you have excuses required for absentee balloting, which is you know, pretty unheard of now. And so you're going to see, I think, some major changes in New York as well. So that's going to come home to us here. The final thing that I want to finish up with, everybody's obviously talking about this massive influx of women into Congress. I think now we're 84th in the world in terms of, you know, representation for women in legislative bodies. What I think is really interesting and what is going to come out is, you know, there's always the gender gap, right? And it doesn't seem to, I saw 20%, 21% or something, so it doesn't seem like the gender gap grew in this election cycle. But what we did see is women usually donate at much lower rates than men, and in this election cycle, they were on par with men. And then the other thing, this is where the story I think is going to come out slowly over time, is activists, volunteers. It was phenomenal, the kinds of activity that was going on, and particularly in suburban districts, right? And so obviously there were groups like Moms Demand Action, right, which was a gun control group. They canvassed they registered 100,000 voters, knocked on 200,000 doors nationally. Then there was, I don't know if you're aware of Indivisible, right, which is kind of a resistance organization that started after 2016. It has chapters across the country. 75% of the people who are running those Indivisible chapters were women. And just anecdotally, what I saw, I live in Princeton, but there was a swing state, or a swing district right next to us. It was Malinowski versus Leonard Lance in the 7th district. And they knocked in the last, so there was a massive canvassing operation for about 2 months. Really every weekend people were canvassing. Last weekend, they knocked on 150,000 doors in the district. Remember, congressional districts have about 700,000 people in them, right? So many times over, doors were being knocked on. And Malinowski won by 5,500 votes. It was a heavy, heavy lift. You know, it was, and to think about all the work that went in, all the volunteers that were needed to make those kinds of things happen. This is, I think, across the country. And anytime you go, you'd see probably about 75% of the people who were there were women. And there were, a lot of them were college-educated white women. So that's the other story that came out of what happened yesterday, is the most democratic voters are of whites. College-educated women are they vote very differently than non-college educated women. And I think a lot of them were among the activists, or leading the activists. So those are my insights, and now I look forward to hearing from you.
Well, maybe it's over with the election of a Democratic Congress, but I'm not sure. It could get even crazier. Because the Mad King, who knows what he will do? This is one of I think, the most unusual periods in American politics, at least in my life. Wow. The New York Times actually giving the score for whether he lied more yesterday than the day before, than the day before, than the day before. The Senate breaking with all precedent and denying a president the right to nominate Supreme Court justices. The president proposing to violate the 14th Amendment, and meanwhile giving encouragement to, inciting, promising to pay the legal bills of the Nazis who are marching in our streets raising torches. This is really a strange period. And maybe it has to do with economic hardship, and maybe it has to do with identity politics. Outgroup Haight, as Sandy says. But here's the thing. If we raise our eyes from our preoccupation with American politics, the first thing we notice is that something broadly like this is happening everywhere in places that are otherwise utterly different. They don't have our Constitution or our 14th Amendment, or they don't have our history, they don't have our particular kind of racism, although they may have their own. But across the developed world, across Europe, we see the rise of political extremism on the right, particularly, and particularly in Eastern Europe. We see it even across the global South. We see it with the rise of Modi in India. We see it in Brazil, Bolsonaro. So we have to explain something in big terms because it's occurring everywhere. So we can't just look at this particular demographic group and its tendency to do this or that. We need a less insular set of explanations that take account not only of the particular economic circumstances or experiences of American voters, their particular racisms, but that can be extended to explain worldwide phenomena. So I propose that if we do that, we will look at broad economic changes that have encapsulated the world. We sometimes call those changes neoliberalism, we sometimes call them globalization, but what we're talking about are the transformations that international capitalism has wrought on communities in the developed world and in the global South, everywhere you look. We're talking about hardship, yes, but hardship afflicting, for example, industrial towns. Have you traveled around the United States lately? It's devastation, it's ruination. And it's the same in much of the world, especially the rich world. The United States is worse because we have policies that ignore this devastation. So, and under these conditions, when people see that their way of life is crumbling, that there's no future for their children, that everything they thought they could take for granted is gone, well, what are they going to do? They're very susceptible under those conditions to leaders that point to scapegoats. Isn't that the way it's always been? Don't we have a huge history of that kind of pattern of leaders who direct the anger of people, anger that results from institutions